I'll say welcome everybody to the first Risk Reading Club, and thanks for your interest and a good turnout in terms of who's coming. So just what are we trying to do here in this Risk Reading Club? We're aiming to build a common language around risk, and particularly how we talk about risk and different elements of risk in the RiskWi's project. We're probably going to try and meet every 6 to 8 weeks and cover a key risk paper in each of those sessions. And I think that there's probably no better person to start us off than somebody who's relatively recently published a paper that reviews 3,283 risk publications. So we'll put that in the expert category. I don't think anybody else can claim to have even got close to something like that. Looking forward to hearing from Adam today. Lots of questions that we have. Some of the questions that I'm thinking about is, will a wider view of risk beyond just production risk reap benefits for us? How should we explore these interactions and compounding factors between risks? And given Adam's call for more nuanced and detailed risk analysis, what might that look like for RiskWi's? So we're hoping that this will be an interactive program. Adam's going to give us an overview of that paper. Of course, I assume, like any book club, that everybody's read the book before coming to book club, but we accept that some people might not have actually got there. So Adam will give us a bit of an overview first. And then we're hoping that it'll be interactive. We've got lots of time for discussions, and the last half really focusing on what this might mean for the RiskWi's initiative as well. So lots of opportunities to interact. Make sure you use your raise hand when we get to those points. Thinking about if you want to clarify things or thinking about what does it mean as we move forward into the RiskWi's project. And with that, handing over to Adam. Thanks, Adam, for accepting, and looking forward to hearing from you.
Okay, thanks, Brendan, for the invitation, and welcome everyone. So my name's Adam Komarek, and today I'll provide an overview of a study that I was part of, and then provide some implications possibly for the RiskWi's project. So a little bit of background. I did my undergraduate thesis on crop livestock mixes under risk for a mixed farm in central west New South Wales, and I still remember going to a ARES conference and describing what I was doing to Brian Hardacre, and then he kind of said, "Oh, you must have rocks in your head for studying risk in agriculture." So I guess I'm still here, so maybe I do. So that's a bit of the background on why I'm here. And so just a little bit of background on risk in general. A lot of ground's already been covered over the years. Risk in agriculture is a well-trodden topic. Just a handful of points. Risk creates reward. In everyday use, risk typically implies maybe something bad. So, there's a risk of problem A or problem B. Risk is also viewed as like the converse of stability sometimes. But of course, there's also upside risk and downside risk. It's not all a negative thing, and context matters. And there's lots of different types of risks. Which ones are more important? Well, you can say it depends. So just for this study, I mean, farmers deal with multiple risks and often at the same time, and one risk can cause another. So take an example of something like the world food crisis in 2008. So there were droughts that caused crop yields to fail in the Middle East and other areas. Then there were price spikes that ensued because supply relative demand changed. And then governments around the world instituted export bans, so a type of institutional risk. And at the same time, other consequences came in related to civil unrest because farm workers had to move from farm producing areas into the city where prices were already high. So it's kind of complicated. Same could be the case for a farm where there's a flood, then crop production fails. You don't have enough revenue to pay your liabilities, creates all sorts of personal problems. So there are these cascading kind of effects. And as part of this study, we sort of thought, sure, okay, we could devise all kinds of scenarios, like test best case and worst case scenarios of what the effect risk is on some measure of a farm's performance. But we also thought, okay, if there is if this is the reality of multiple types of risks being present and they all interact, then we sort of asked, well, what's being studied in the literature? I mean, we know risk is complicated, but we wanted to see okay, how does the research align in terms of what is happening for the realities of the farmers? So there's a paper we wrote, and the paper's titled "A Review of Types of Risks in Agriculture: What We Know and What We Need to Know." So there's also a link there to a blog post on the paper, and I mean all the data that was part of the paper is also publicly available online. And the gist of the study was, where the objective was, we were trying to examine the extent to which the existing peer-reviewed literature provides sufficient support for a more holistic approach to risk management that potentially includes examining the multiple types of risks farmers face and to evaluate their effects jointly. So the focus here was on agriculture, farms, and the risks that are relevant to them. So just a little bit more of an overview of the study. It was a review paper. So we reviewed the 5 major types of risks in agriculture related to production, markets, personal or idiosyncratic risks, and institutional risks. So that they're all the business risks, and then also financial risk as a separate one. So what we did is we searched the web of science for all available studies on risk in agriculture, and we had no restriction on the year the study was from or the location, so it was global, going back as far as the database had. We found about 5,500 papers on this topic, and then what we did is we applied a selection criteria of what studies to keep in our assessment. So we wanted to keep studies that actually quantitatively studied risk, so the effect of a risk on a indicator of relevance to a farm, whether it's grain yield, farm income, prices, all that kind of stuff. Or risk was really part of the narrative of the study, and risk wasn't just a tangential point in the abstract. And we're focusing on agricultural production mainly, not so much consumption, and we're focused on mainly crops and livestock, not so much things like forest and trees. So then we're left with about 3,300 studies, and then I guess all we did is we recorded what types of risks were studied in those 3,300 papers. So that's the main thing. So we looked at what was studied, and we sort of came at it from the perspective of what should be studied, in the sense that if farmers do face many risks at the same time sort of occurring, and if they're sometimes related and cascading, then how does the literature stack up to that? So from the 3,283 papers that we extracted in the review, that about 2,000 were looking only at production risks, for things related to, weather variability would be a big one there. 434 were only looking at market risks, so related to prices of inputs and outputs, markets. 66 were looking at financial risks only, 60 personal risks only, and about 80 only looking at institutional risks. So in terms of the combinations of what risks were studied, there are 18 papers out of the 3,000 that sort of looked at all 5 risks at the same time. And you might ask, how can you study all 5 risks at the same time? These studies that did this were more of a narrative or a review itself. So what we did see was it was quite rare to study more than one risk at the same time. So we did find that 15% of studies considered more than one type of risk, and the most common combination was to study market and production risk. And I think there's a fairly logical explanation to the results here, that given the biological nature of agriculture, it's linked to weather, and then that agricultural products are sold in markets, that prices and weather matter a lot. So I guess we sort of saw that there was limited attention on the multiple types of risks that occur at the same time, and that may appear at odds with sort of the reality of what is occurring on farms and in agricultural businesses. So just to sort of clarify, you can ask, is there any concern with the fact that 2/3 of studies examined only production risk and 15% considered more than one type of risk. Well, I mean, maybe not. Like a detailed understanding of how grain yield responds to variability in water and nutrients is sort of always important. And these is like a sort of a one at a time risk analysis. But also, I guess not all risks are equal. So most variation in annual wheat gross margins might be because of variability in rainfall. So, you know, the focus on production risk is sort of could be justified in that sense. But what we sort of thought was maybe a more detailed analysis of the multiple types of risks faced by farmers that at the same time may provide more information to devise options to manage risk and reward. That was what we were sort of thinking in our conclusions. And then just a few reflections. What we did after the paper, we sort of looked back and thought, okay, so we didn't quantify the importance of each type of risk towards a farmer objective. So, you know, we didn't like decompose a risky variable, like take a simple one, wheat gross margin over time. We didn't decompose that into, okay, what amount of variation in that gross margin is from variable prices or variable weather. So that wasn't really part of what we did. And I mean, we didn't really break down in a nuanced way the scales of the different analysis, like whether the risk was studied at the field level or at the enterprise level or the farm system level or the business level. We didn't also break down the time dimension of the study. So was risk studied in a short-term sense, or did it have a long sort of temporal dimension as well? So some variables in the world are slow moving, some are rapid changes. So if a flood comes along, that's a rapid change. Whereas like slow moving things that can create risks and stress over time, maybe declining terms of trade or changes in labour supply. And another thing, the role of labour wasn't considered in too much detail. Of course, it's an idiosyncratic risk to an individual farm and their supply of labour. But I mean, in a sense, it was sort of underplayed a bit in the study we did. And then, I mean, the last point there, why and how to study multiple risks. We tried to reflect a bit on the paper in terms of why to study them. And I guess it's because farmers manage multiple risks all at the same time. But if researchers are focusing on risks as individual separate events, maybe we're missing some of the richness there that occurs in the field. And then, of course, the question is how to do it. And I mean, we had some ideas in terms of the risks that can sometimes be measured through historical probability distributions for things like prices and weather. There can be the role of stochastic simulation there. And then we were thinking for the other types of risks related to idiosyncratic risks, policy risks, financial risks, more in terms of different scenarios and what if examples. So I know a lot of people involved in the RiskWi project have studied risk for a long time, and maybe some of this, what's in this review, sounds a bit like deja vu. So I think that's the crux of the paper, and then I think we could have a Q&A, or if there's any questions on the paper specifically, and then after that, I had 3 slides on possible implications for the RiskWi project. Thank you.
Perfect. Thanks, Adam. Thanks for that overview. And indeed, there's lots of people on the call that have been working on risk for a long time. So we're hoping that this brings a fruitful discussion through as well. So as I said before, it's really an open forum here to start discussing risk, and I mean, particularly in the context of Adam's paper, but also generally, what do we want to discuss about risk as well, given we've got a lot of risk experts on the call as well. So does anybody want to start us off with any questions? Please, Dave. We still can't hear you, Dave.
He's not muted, so it can't be that.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Now we can.
Yeah.
Teams was set up for a headset, and it hadn't realised I'd taken the headset out. So thanks, Adam. It was interesting. I guess not surprising terribly, but interesting to sort of get numbers on the preponderance of production risk. I was a little bit surprised that there wasn't more studies that looked jointly at production risk and market risk. I mean, most of the studies that I've been involved in have done that, have looked at prices as well as yields varying. I guess maybe you've included papers here. They're not just economic papers, they're production simulation type papers as well. So maybe that's the explanation for that.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, that's true. So a lot of the papers, so production risk and market risk was the most commonly studied risk at the same time by far. And I think so a lot of the papers we found were in journals like agricultural systems. There was like biological based papers and economics papers, but a lot of the papers that, there's lots from Western Australia that look at like sequences of weather and prices, and that was definitely the biggest combination in a sense.
Thinking about doing all five, I mean, I can understand why people who are doing models wouldn't include institutional risk or personal risk, because they're sort of quite imponderable, really. They're and specific to particular times or places or circumstances. But financial risk might be one that you could potentially build in. So what do you? I mean, it's asking a lot to remember the details, but do you remember studies that had combined production risk, market risk, and financial risk in a modelling sort of sense, and how they did that?
So, I mean, off the top of my head, I can't remember exact details, but I imagine it would have been studies that included things on like sensitivity to changes in interest rates in terms of loans, and then coupled with the other two. And I think also with the idiosyncratic risk, like it is definitely a personal risk. Like, okay, if my jackaroo leaves or gets sick and goes away, then okay, I can't do my jobs. It's a big problem, but I'm also not sure like how important it is, or is it a role for researchers, or that's sort of what I'm thinking as well. Same for policy. If a beef cattle station faces an export ban and they can't really manage it, well, maybe they can diversify, but they can't do much about it. Whereas like price and production risk, you can manage in a sense to some degree more than those other risks. So
yeah,
some
makes sense.
External and internal. But what do we do with this? Thank you.
Marta?
Yeah, well, following up on that, I think it does depend a bit on the context. I've been involved in a couple of studies with irrigation. So when you've got irrigation, you've got big capital costs in infrastructure, so that if the financial risk side of things comes into play. So that's a good example where there might be more in around that area. So.
Yeah, the financial risk would be with sort of capital expenditures, possibly. Yeah.
Peter?
Yeah, so thanks. So I'm not an economist, but I've hung around economists for a while. So I think I really like the paper. I think it's a really good reminder of the broader spectrum, and I like your sense of this sort of idiosyncratic risks, but that's still at a farm level that really matters, and we don't pay enough attention to that. And I think your notion of that's a really helpful one. I guess one thing is in my mind, in the 1990s, there was a lot of discussion about drought policy and what's so special about drought, and these ideas about including more complex notions of exceptional circumstances. that's being repeated again with ABARES and their drought early warning system that Neil Hughes is doing, which starts with the point that sort of farm hardship is not just about rainfall, it's about rainfall as it impacts on production, and then how that interacts with prices and interest rates, and coming up with that in their farm predict model and so on. So David Thompson and Roy Powell did do this risk farm, which looked at, and so that they talked a lot about holistic approaches to risk, and the idea of multiplying all these distributions together. And I was involved with some of that for Liverpool Plains. I guess I'd have to say, in the end, in terms of the response to farmers, is what you end up with is just these really thin tails. So you end up with a situation where things can go really bad. You can have a bad price and a bad season with bad interest rates, or you end up with this really thin tail at the other end of really good outcomes. And when you do it at a whole farm level, you may as well throw in buying the lottery or something, because you get these, and get an even thinner tail almost. So you get these sort of extremes, and then when you have the discussion, you just naturally look at these extreme tails. I think they're important, but I guess, and even with, and then going back to what ABARES is doing, they're saying we have to do this, but they're only using the last 20 years because they only have the economic data for the last 20 years. Well, the problem with talking about drought using 20 years is a problem, because you're removing so much of your climate record and so on. So I guess what my point is that there are benefits of holism. There's also costs of holism, and that in terms of the analysis and in terms of the communication of it.
Yes. Good point. Yeah, I mean, maybe it's, I guess that's why I'm sort of thinking, like, which risk is most, where does most of the variation come from over time in income, and what are the main, the main risks in different places to sort of help, target research. Yeah, those thin tails.
So I mean, I do think that, I searched in the paper for drought, and the only references to drought in terms of reference and drought policy were in Niger and Ethiopia. For discussion for RiskWi's, I do think that's an area where, how drought policy interacts is an area that is a fertile area where, for a long time, people have talked hard about this, different ways of thinking about risk.
Okay, thanks, Peter.
So related to that, I reckon, the paper focuses on the opportunities for looking more at the interactions between different types of risks. It reminds me of the review by Mick Keogh and others, 2014, where they recommended that agriculture needs to do a lot more to take a systems approach to risk. I must admit, I never really got clear what that meant, and I'm just wondering, I don't think it's the same thing, but I think it's worth discussing, because we're obviously taking a systems approach in this project, what we think is a systems approach. Have you got any idea, Adam, of what might be meant by a systems approach to risk?
There's different types of systems. A systems approach could be the farm system, or the whole farm business as a system, and just not looking at individual things in isolation. But yeah, there may be more systematic ways to sort of assess risk in terms of which is more important, or where the points of vulnerability are. But maybe you're sort of, the systems approach is setting up what you're trying to study in a way.
Yeah, I think that's probably closer, I assume, to what's feasible, without, like what Peter mentioned, where it just becomes so difficult to to have so many different interacting elements of risk, but I think it's worth us thinking about.
And then I think with a lot of those interactions, it'll just come down to your assumptions on how the interactions relate, right? So you could build a model of how a farm would respond to perturbations in their parameter sets, but for some of the risks you don't really know, and it just end up being what assumptions you use. So you have to be cautious of that as well, not getting too buried into modeling exercises, and keep the big picture of the risk and reward, and what the major risks are. Maybe labour is a major constraint for farming systems that sort of gets coupled with weather risk, right? Yeah, with machinery and all those things. So there could be just widening that view there a bit.
Marta?
Yeah, the other thing you mentioned in your paper, which I quite like, is the risk attitudes, which has been looked at a lot. I was involved in that myself, and Dave panel a lot as well, and others. But you actually, instead of talking of different levels of risk aversion from low to very high or something, you actually identified what they are. So you've got the pessimist and the realist and I quite like that. I think that could work really well, because risks mean different things for different people, and they will react differently to them. So I think whatever decision matrix or something we come up with in the end, we'll have to have that extra layer as well with these kinds of things, because different metrics will be relevant to different levels of aversion with specific characteristics. So we are actually narrowing down what that risk aversion is or might be. So I quite like that as well. So yeah.
Thank you.
In the spirit of keeping it half about the paper and half about implications, Adam, do you want to continue on with your next slides around the implications for RiskWi's?
Okay, I'll do that. Yep. Here we go. So, I mean, I guess I thought one thing for RiskWi's might be what risk matters most for who, and I guess sort of where. So, it's there's an old literature on decomposing a risky variable into where the most variation comes from. Is variation in farm income from, is it more coming from variable weather, variable prices? What else can you look at? Maybe if you have one less worker on your farm, well, that's probably a big issue. I mean, maybe you could set up some kind of way to look at the implications of the different types of risks there. And I guess it's all relative to the decision maker as well, right? So, variation in income for one farm is different to another based on the season of their life, if they're about to retire, or if they've got really high equity levels, which comes down to sort of how to target. Maybe you can target investments better if you know what risks are most important and where. So that was sort of one thing to think about, what risks matter for most. I know as part of the ARGs, there'll be the action research groups, different risk management strategies are being sort of canvassed, and then I guess it could be maybe an idea to think, sort of wider context. Are these the most important? Just to sort of step back, there's the agronomic side of the farm business, but there's sort of there's the other bits and pieces as well. And maybe it's true that nitrogen fertilizer management is the biggest issue. So, well, then that's okay. That's sort of just what risk matters for who would be one thing. Then the next sort of loose idea I was thinking is sort of like the scale of the analysis. So, I mean, attitudes toward risk are like sort of at the level of the decision maker who's making the risky decision. And typically in the literature, it's like you're averse to risk with respect to your wealth plus, and then you make a decision, and then your income is variable. So that's sort of related to the scale of what you're what you're studying, and there's different scales in a farm. There's the farm business, and then that can be broken down into the farming production system, but then there's also the non-farm and off-farm stuff, and then that can get broken down into crops and animals, and then within crops there's crop sequences and nitrogen management and all this kind of stuff. So maybe you're making decisions at the field scale, but the sort of risk attitude is for the whole business. So I mean, yeah, maybe you can be like a pessimist with the rate of nitrogen you're applying. So you apply a rate where you'll have the highest minimum value over time, but you might be an optimist with your stocking rate where you're just looking for the maximum, the highest maximum, rather than being a realist and sort of aiming for the average. So I think there's something to say about the scale of the analysis in terms of this project, is where the decisions are made. And like typically in agricultural economics, it's sort of work at the whole farm level and do the analysis there, but there's a lot of work at the plot and the field level as well, and how that sort of relates is something I'm not sure where to go, but with this project there could be a starting point there. And then the last sort of idea I had was like a more of a union of the classic farming systems research, which is very technical, site specific, and sort of trying to get a union there with more of sort of behavioral economics. So kind of thinking to start with a normative approach where you would canvass risk reward options with farmers, and then you could work with one action research group and they identify some options that they're interested in studying, nitrogen management or autonomous machinery, and also stretching into newer options that may have a sort of a larger impact on the risk reward scene, whatever that is it digital agriculture or in season tactical choices? I don't know too much about what they are, but then the next step would be, of course, technical assessment of the options. So there's lots of papers that study how a change in management alters a range of indicators. So how changes in fertilizer rates will affect the average gross margin of a field, but also then the conditional value of risk of that field. Then the question is, okay, how can you use that information from like a technical assessment? Potentially you could rank the different options that have been put forward to the action research groups or they've developed, and sort of say, okay, if you're a realist, if you're looking to have the highest average, well, choice A is the best for you. But then if you're an optimist and what you're trying to do is get the highest return possible in any one of the years, then there might be something different for you. You might also be a pessimist where you're trying to obtain the highest sort of lowest gross margin over all your sequences of years, and then there might be a safety first approach as well where you're trying to not fall below a different level. So there could be a technical assessment of the different options for farmers, and then typically a lot of research papers, they kind of stop there, right? So we identify a practice to study, we go out and we calculate how planting lucerne on a mixed farm increases operating profit, or maybe it then lowers the coefficient of variation of income, all these kinds of things. Then potentially we can take those options to the farmers and see, okay, which choices do they prefer, and then how does that align with these decision criteria of being a realist or optimist or pessimist. And then potentially from that you can sort of then tailor different management practices to sort of, maybe they're like typologies of farmers who are more sort of looking just to manage for the average, or they're really worried about downside risk, or they're really trying to just maximize their maximum. So there's some of the three ideas that I had. They're all quite rough, but I thought I'd share them anyway, just to get some discussion going, and especially for a large long-term project like RiskWi that goes for 4 years, I think there's a bit of a chance to think at the beginning of some, approaches that combine research with on-the-ground work that can say something new about risk and reward.
Thanks, Adam.
Thank
We're going to, I think, go to Rick with a project sort of viewpoint, and then open up to the discussion again.
Okay.
Yeah, so you caught me by surprise there, Brendan. Yeah, thinking a bit more about this, I wonder whether, from the project viewpoint, I mean, we're starting off focusing on quite specific, singular decisions. Like initially, a lot of attention on nitrogen, like you sort of touched on there, Adam. And I've had a few suggestions from groups that if we think a bit broader, we might get closer to this sort of systems approach and interacting risks. And you think of a big shift, like a shift from their current system to, say, a stripper disk, or like you mentioned, I think, Adam, the autonomous systems, which is actually quite a complex move. And just your comments then just made me wonder whether thinking of those more substantial shifts beyond just individual decisions and individual practices or rates even would be the vehicle to tackle some of these things. It has come up as suggestions, but anyway, I just sort of throw it out there from the project perspective, because that's a choice that we've got in terms of how defined and narrow we want things to be to make analysis easier versus tackling some of those more substantial but genuinely important and complex changes and decisions.
I just have a thought just completely off the top of my head. I mean, a lot of Australian farmers do have like quite high levels of equity in a sense, and grain farming is quite profitable nowadays. Yeah, maybe there is opportunity for a bit of experimentation, especially with sort of healthy looking balance sheets. It's not like this is low input farming in Africa and really worried about a kilogram of fertilizer. But of course, that's also a concern as well. If it doesn't rain, then the fertilizer gets washed away.
Many West Australian farmers have had their best 2 years on record for the last 2 years, so they're pretty cashed up and debt's pretty low, if there's any debt at all on some farms. So
yeah,
that's definitely so financial risk isn't really a consideration for them.
Yeah, it's also like if you're, I don't know, looking at like a certainty equivalent where you've sort of got the profit and taking away a risk premium. Maybe the risk premiums are low, but that doesn't mean. Yeah, that's just at the moment, right? So maybe now's a chance to sort of look at some new technologies that can really like raise the average productivity or profitability.
I got the ball rolling there on some big ideas for RiskWi, transformational change and other things. Forum is open for people to throw anything out. Ben. We can't hear you there, Ben, sorry. And it is a thing with Teams, with whatever you had set up last time. If you don't have that exactly set up this time, Teams will disavow you. While Ben's sorting that out, anybody else?
Can I ask just one question? Is there any panel data, farm level panel data in Australia that can be used in this kind of an exercise for risk assessment that has been underutilized? I mean, the kind of a data that we can explore and we can integrate with the other data sets like weather or the price data.
So a question to the room rather than directly at Adam as well. People know of these.
I mean, I know isn't there a GRDC paddock grower paddock survey that was done for 4 years, but I'm not sure at what scale or what was collected there. If it was just an agronomic survey. But I think there's something called the National Paddock Grower Project.
Yeah, CSIRO holds the data for that through Roger Laws, but it was more of a snapshot or cross section rather than a sequence of seasons. That's the challenge, I think.
Okay.
Do we have Ben yet? We don't. Ben, feel free to pop your question in the chat as a workaround.
Adam, Ricky Fossey from WA. Just to thank you for your paper. Just a few things. In the results section, I've highlighted that you've got financial risk. I'll just paraphrase. Financial obligations more like a loan. It's quite a simplified statement. I think it's a lot more than that. And obviously, there's been a bit of discussion about the combination of production risk and market risk and financial risk, and I think we need to explore them a bit further. I've also noticed in your paper the exclusion of 2011, which was significant, especially from a market risk perspective, and noticed that the paper's only gone up to 2019. We've had significant market risk and financial risk with COVID and the Ukraine war. Is there any opportunity to look at that post 2019? Because they've had significant impacts on input costs, decision making, and I'm just interested to know why 2011 was missed out, because our markets went to cactus overnight. It had a massive impact on the market. Yes, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on
that. Sure. I mean, the paper includes studies from 2011. Does it say something different in the text? I have to double check that, because it was like from, it should include that year.
It says through this examination we excluded 2011 studies from the database.
Oh yeah,
that's the number of studies, not the year.
Yeah, that's not the year.
Okay.
So we had like 5,500 papers, and then we removed 2011.
Okay. Sorry, I misread. I scanned it that quickly. I was thinking, because that's a significant year of market. Sorry about that.
Yeah.
But also, I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts on post, like COVID and also Ukraine war on markets and production.
Sure. Yeah. So I guess that's the thing with risk. Like, events just keep coming along that we wouldn't have thought would have happened. We could never know that would happen, like the Corona-19 virus and a war. So I think it just strengthens the importance to be prepared for uncertainty, in a sense. Like, you can manage the things that you know about, like the historical distribution of weather and prices and something, but then there's always those random things that no one would have, very hard to conceive that would have happened, like, as you said, the COVID-19 or the Ukraine war. So you kind of need to be prepared, and then possibly looking back at the studies, there could be some change in what's been studied more recently, and those high level global events would impact at the local level too, in some sense.
Yeah. Thanks. I also noticed there was someone mentioned about drought. Obviously, the federal government has allocated a lot of funding to drought, and it probably is wrapped up in the production risk studies, but the number does seem a little bit low, because I know a lot of the drought hubs did situation analysis on drought studies, and it is pivotal in terms of understanding production risk, and drought is a major factor across the studies. So it is a good point that was raised earlier about drought and how that has actually been included in the production profile, I guess.
Yes. Yep, they're all good points. Thanks. Thanks, Ricky.
Marta, you had your hand up.
It was from a while ago. It was related to some discussion that we had a little bit earlier on about ways of possible ways of tackling these or presenting things, or I mean, given it's a GRDC funded project, there might be interest in linking to other GRDC funded projects that have happened over the past decade or so. And there were quite a few around yield gap, and you know, the social. In one of them, we sort of try to frame things in terms of a socio-economic yield gap, like accounting for economic constraints as well as behavior, also risk-related, risk aversion constraints, that sort of thing. So, you know, how can we inform decisions in a way that it reduces that gap? So that could be another way of presenting things, perhaps. Or in terms of trade-offs, everything is a trade-off, and how are different farmers with different attitudes to risk willing to forego profit, and so a pessimist will be willing to forego less profit than other a more risk taker farmer profile. So that sort of thing. So how much are you prepared to forego, and how can we minimize that or reduce that to some extent by through you know, decisions, informed decisions, basically. So it's just ideas on how to maybe frame or present or discuss these things. That's all.
Okay. Thanks, Martha.
Sandy.
Yeah, just further to what Marta said, a lot of what we're thinking about at heart, we're leading one of the ARGs in South Australia, and that is getting farmers to be comfortable in their decision making, as opposed to this focus on making the best decision, because the best decision is different for everyone. So it's providing that level of comfort where they feel like they have the tools to be able to make a decision that they can fall asleep at night and be happy at the end of the season, rather than picking a best solution.
Yeah, that's a good point. Would an example be like if you're making a decision around nitrogen fertilizer management, that the farmers sort of course they know what it's going to do, but there's all the implications of it at different levels for the business. It's not just in the field.
Yeah, that's a really good example. And then further to that, actually being able to look back in hindsight, knowing how the season then panned out, and still being comfortable that given what you knew at the time, you made the best decision you could based on your own circumstances. So it's as much as maximizing your opportunity, but also being comfortable that you didn't stretch yourself too far because you felt under pressure and it all turned to shit at the end. And then you go, I shouldn't have done that. Like having confidence in the decision you made, knowing that you may miss a little bit of upside, but it didn't turn into a disaster because you felt comfortable with what level you're at. That obviously looks different for someone who has a much more adverse attitude to risk or vice versa. But yeah, that concept about being comfortable because they had the tools to make a decision that suited them. Yeah,
that's a good point. So identifying, maybe if you know what the pitfalls are a bit more, you're prepared for the future.
And that's some of the language that we're trying to work through in the project around separating outcome from process as well. And so even in the baseline, trying to make, when we talk about it, we're not just talking about what did you get at the end, but how did you actually make that decision? So hopefully that will start coming in as we move through the project. Ben's also put his comment. I'm assuming it's more of a comment than a question, Ben, as I read it, but it's in the chat for people as well around season of life and balance sheet and relationships between the different pillars there as well. Rick.
Yeah, Ben makes a good comment there referring to finance and how important it is. And I think Ricky made a comment as well about what you've got is a reasonably narrow definition of what some might see as a reasonably narrow definition of what financial risk is, very much focused around loan servicing essentially, or loan obligations. I'm just if RiskWi is trying to avoid too much talk about semantics and definitions, but maybe this is one forum where it can be tackled a little bit. I'd be interested in people's opinion of that. I mean, you define risk, financial risk, very narrowly. Some people combine it with price risk and other things. But I'm just wondering how standard that is, and how clear we need to be around that.
Okay. Well, I think the way we did it, we separated all risk into business risk and then financial risk. So like business risk is like related to the operating activities of the farm, and then it doesn't matter where the money comes from to buy your fertilizer. The fertilizer will still create yield. And then the financial risk was related to, I don't have the definition off the top of my head, but it's like if interest rates go up or if your loan defaults, it's like the financing side of the business, not so much the business itself. That's how we tried to separate it in a sense. So like, I don't know, like farm management economics, there's like a business has operating activities, investing activities, and then financing activities, and then that was how we tried to.
So with that definition, like Dave I think touched on earlier in WA, or in a situation where there's no loan, then there isn't financial risk, is it?
Yeah, I mean in that, or there's no debt. I mean, in the narrow sense that we use, sort of, yeah. Yeah, but I mean, I guess finance, the word itself, sort of can be used in different contexts, right? So I think we're here more talking like, financing, or like debt and loan obligations and liabilities in a sense. Yeah, which, yeah.
Do others have different views on what? Because it comes up a lot, of course, financial risk in RiskWi when people are referring to it.
So maybe I'll jump in already. Related to that, is there room in this project to talk about crop insurance, crop insurance? Like there's the variations of that, the multi-peril crop insurance versus field-based insurance and others. Is that something we should discuss as well? Thanks.
Yeah, I'll just jump in. I mean, there is scope, but I must admit it hasn't come up at all in the probably 10 or so discussion groups that I've had, which is quite amazing. But yeah.
Rick, if I can just add a comment there. In terms of our risk enterprise theme, it'll definitely come through our projects in Western Australia, as will all input costs, and looking at gross margins and finance as a whole, and certainly not just as a loan. It'll be the whole package. And if I'd just like to clarify, there is certainly still a lot of West Australian growers who do have loans. So I would hate to think that as a generalisation, purely on the basis because there's a lot of growth and land buy that is actually happening as well. So we would hate to think that as a generalisation that there isn't a component of pressure with also interest rates.
Yeah, but hopefully I didn't suggest that WA farmers don't have loans, but
they probably wish they didn't. But yeah, so when we're looking at finance, it'll be the whole package, and the risk enterprise theme will certainly cover that whole matrix and the decision model trees as we expand out just beyond nitrogen.
We're moving very close to the end here, and in the spirit of everybody jumping on between meetings and everything, I can see 2 hands up. Hopefully they're very quick questions so that we don't go over time. Ben, do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. I think finance risk is it muted? Can't believe that.
Oh, we can hear you.
Keep going.
Okay, so you're just scratching your ear. So I think finance risk and business risk are intimately linked, and trying to separate them is almost impossible. And especially the case when you move away from the family farm towards more complex farm structures, where you perhaps have an owner or a financer who's separate from the manager. I mean, we seem to be just talking about family farms here, but if you've got someone who's providing the finance who's not necessarily the manager, then that's all financial risk. And I think financial risk comes into it as soon as you can't buy as much fertilizer as you wanted to, because you have an overdraft limit, or you can't invest in an optimal piece of machinery because you've got some lending limit, or the bank is not sure whether you're going to repay it because of asymmetric information between you and the bank. So yeah, I would keep financial risk at the front of this project. So that's my view. Thank you.
I'll take it as a comment and move to Peter.
So really quickly, just I think words are important. I think you've given us a good vocabulary. I just think, in my experience, where I've used pessimism with farmers, I think in some ways I've replaced that with caution, and it's worked much better. So these words do matter, and even saying realism, I think optimism's a good word, pessimism, but realism, we're all nominal realists, and so I think we need to, especially for a project like this, words do matter, including the understanding of words that farmers hear when we say things like pessimism and realism.
Yep, good, excellent point.
And that's probably a good point to finish on as we think about the purpose of the reading club and trying to get our language and our parlance and everything together as well. And especially even things like using risk reward and having the associations of positive, negative, and everything like that. It is quite complex to try and pull this together. So thanks everybody for participating. A big thanks to Adam there as well for taking the first up hit there and bringing us through that and some fruitful conversation there as well. We don't have a next speaker lined up. If people want to email me with suggestions for papers or speakers that we can hunt down for our next, please do so. And as we move on and into the Sydney meeting, thanks everybody for attending here and getting us started really well. Thanks everybody.
Excellent. Thanks, Brendan.
Thanks, Brendan. Thanks everyone.
Thanks, Brendan.
Yep. Bye.